John chapter 12 is the end of Jesus's public ministry and the beginning of his private ministry in chapters 13 through 17 to the disciples. And in commenting on the end of that public ministry, two texts are quoted between verses 37 and 40, both from Isaiah. Isaiah 53 is quoted, and then Isaiah chapter 6, verse 10 is quoted. And this is in the context of judgment, blinding, hardening of hearts. Maybe that's why it's not the most popular chapter to memorize from or preach from in the Gospel of John. But what's fascinating is I honestly think what frequently happens is we see an Old Testament text being cited and we sort of lose focus. Sometimes because we don't know what the context was, or, okay, yeah, I've read that before, and we lose focus as to what's really going on in the New Testament text. So blinding their eyes and hardening their hearts and all the rest of this type of stuff. Or we start thinking about what that might mean. It sounds really judgmental, and that raises questions about justice and stuff like that. And so our minds go that way. And so I just think the vast majority of Christians just sort of blow on by verse 41. These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke concerning him. Okay. Ever thought about what that means? These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke concerning him. Well, Isaiah, who are you talking about? Well, when did Isaiah say these things? Well, some people say, well, there's two quotations from Isaiah. In verse 38, you have Isaiah 53. In verse 40, you have Isaiah 6:10. And the best Unitarians try to get away from acknowledging that the citation, verse 40, is what's being talked about. But we can prove that it is. These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory. Now, what's interesting to me is, again, my critical edition, the Greek New Testament, National 28th edition, has Isaiah 6:1 in the margin right next to verse 41. The editors there recognize what's being referred to. But can we prove that it really is Isaiah's temple vision that John is making reference to here? And the answer is yes. See, here's what verse 41 is saying. These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory, the glory of Jesus. That's the only him in this context. Even the next verse. Some of the high priests, or the leaders, actually, not the high priests, but the leaders believed in him. But because the Pharisees, they were not confessing him, or they might not be put out of the synagogue. So there were Jews who were believing in who? In Jesus. That's the only him in the context. So what John's argument is these things Isaiah said because he saw Jesus' glory and he spoke about him. Well, where did Isaiah see Jesus' glory? There are some that try to say, well, that was Isaiah 53, the coming of the Messiah. The Messiah would be glorious. Maybe, but there's a much more obvious and truthful answer to that. If you remember Isaiah 6:1 says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. And it's not Yahweh there, it's Adonai. I saw the Lord lofty and lifted up, and the train of his robe was filling the temple. Remember? I'll never forget the day when I stumbled onto the reality that the Greek Septuagint does not read identically to the Hebrew Masoretic text at Isaiah 6:1. There's what's called a textual variant there. And the Greek Septuagint, which would have been, at the time of the writing of the Gospel of John, the version of the Hebrew scriptures that John's audience would be reading from. And it's what he's quoting from. He quotes from the Septuagint. When you read the Greek Septuagint, it says, in the year the king Uzziah died, I saw the Lord lofty and lifted up, and his glory was filling the temple. Not the train of his robe, but his glory. So there in Isaiah 6, the only place where I saw, and then the very same term glory that is used here, his glory. It's Isaiah 6:1. So what does that mean? Well, Isaiah, who did you see? Well, I saw Yahweh sitting upon his throne. John, who did Isaiah see? John says, Jesus. Because doesn't that fit perfectly with John 1:18? No one has seen God at any time, but the monogenes theos, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has exegeted him. He has made him known. That's why in Genesis 18 and 19, when Yahweh and two angels come to visit Abram, and then Abram and the two angels go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abram goes off with who? Yahweh. And even though he does the 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 type thing, you still can't find 10 righteous people in Sodom. And so in Genesis 19:24, it says, Yahweh rained fire and brimstone on Sodom from Yahweh in heaven. Two Yahwehs? Well, there was the one that was walking with Abram, and then you have that one raining fire and brimstone from Yahweh in heaven. Who was walking with Abram? Who was seen by Isaiah? Who has exegeted the Father and made him known? The Son, Jesus. So these texts, they're right there in front of us, but very often either because our minds are focused upon other things, or because we might not be aware of some of the historical, translational, exegetical issues. There's so much evidence for the deity of Christ in the New Testament that it is that for anyone who accepts this as the Word of God as a whole, there can be no question of that teaching. You have to atomize it. You have to break it up. You have to break it up into parts and place the parts at contradiction to one another to try to get around that. And that's what modern leftism does in the academy. What does this have to do with us today? Well, very, very briefly, I just simply point out a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago now, I was asked to be on the Dr. Drew show on CNN on the subject of transgenderism with some transgender people. And at one point in discussing why I would say that there is a God-ordained norm in regards to gender, I went to Matthew chapter 19 and I said, what you need to remember is the one who taught these things left behind an empty grave. The point being that unless there is an authority above polls, governments, whatever's popular in pop culture, we will have absolute anarchy. But there is a standard, and it's been revealed to us, and it's, I would say its greatest bulwark is the fact that the one who said, this is the word of God, this is that which by which you will be judged, left behind an empty grave. And no one else has ever done that. That's the ultimate proof. That's the ultimate authority. That's the ultimate power. That's the Jesus that we've been talking about. And so when we try to bring his word to bear upon all the important things going on in our world today, we can't allow ourselves to be put in the position of thinking, well, this is just my personal choice versus your personal choice. No, we're talking about the I Am who entered into human flesh. And his authority is absolutely ultimate.